I think the first mistake and a big thing that I've learned with operating a record label is actually learning to let go a little bit. As a fan of music and in certain aspects of the music industry, you're super passionate about something, right? Like that's the whole magic of music. You become passionate about project, about scene, about an artist, and you really, really, really want to like work with them. But actually, like in a record label, you are not the captain of your own ship as much as you think you are. Like sometimes you let like the tides of culture take you where things need to go.
Mixcloud.
The Inside Track.
All right, welcome back to another edition of the Inside Track. I'm very excited to welcome our guest this week. We have David Zhou, the founder of Eastern Margins, which we've talked about just before the call. You've kind of described as a music company and or what was the other kind of description you used?
Cultural diffusion platform is what we also think of ourselves.
Amazing. I'm excited to kind of get into it, to talk to you today about music across Asia, the actual economics behind setting up a record label, some of the tools that you guys use, some of the lessons that you've learned along the way. And actually, even before we get started, I just want to wish everybody a happy Lunar New Year. We're recording this actually on Wednesday, the 29th of January, which completely coincidentally is actually the Lunar New Year.
Auspicious.
Right? Very auspicious.
Exactly.
So we'll have to see what's in the moon and the stars and the alignment of the planets as well. I was just reading an article about how 5 or 6 of the planets in our solar system are aligning in a line at the moment. So who knows what that all means.
It is a very cosmic alignment right now. I can't confess I know all of the details of what the symbolism means, but I'm looking forward to it.
I'm sure it means this will be a good podcast. That's probably what it means. But David, we've known each other, I don't know, quite a few years, right? Because you used to work alongside me at Mixcloud. But I'd love to kind of maybe start out just hearing about your initial early journey in music. What were the sounds or the scenes that you kind of first started hearing growing up, and kind of what brought you to music and kind of, made you fall in love with it, I guess?
Yeah, it's really interesting because my journey with music is pretty intrinsically tied to like my geographic journey and my journey in terms of upbringing. I think a massive thing for me is that when I moved from mainland China to the UK when I was a kid, I was about 7 or 8 years old. That definitely took a lot of time to kind of get used to a new society, new culture, and all of that. And actually, music was a massive source of identity for me early on. It was one of the ways that I found a common language with the kids around me, with everyone around me. And actually, when I first started out, I was always an indie rock kid. So kind of grew up on like guitars, had every single Radiohead like B-side that you could think of, like live recording, like proper kind of crate digging on that side of things. But it was actually in my teens where I discovered electronic music, and especially actually the angle through that was Kid A, Radiohead. That was an album that really, really kind of like transformed my thinking about electronic music. And it's really like electronic music and the rave, I would say, where I kind of came of age. I found something incredibly liberating and powerful in the environment of a rave where no one really cares like where you're from. Nobody cares what your background is. In that moment, in a dark room, everyone is kind of together, like pulling in one direction. And I found that really, really liberating as someone who moved from one society to a really, really different one and had spent kind of a long time in my childhood finding my sense of belonging and finding my sense of self. Actually, like electronic and rave music kind of was the first genesis of where I felt like comfortable.
Were there any kind of venues that you used to go to back in the day that might exist or not exist anymore that kind of hold a special place in your heart?
I mean, I'd like love to give the trendy answer and say like, I discovered myself at Plastic People and all of that stuff, which, I did go to a lot, but honestly, the venues that I frequented and I really, really discovered myself were kind of like car parks with my friends and the back of a supermarket with like a Bluetooth speaker, JLB speaker. And I think actually that kind of attitude really, really like informs a lot of what we do at Eastern Margins. It's like the second part of the name, the margins. Like what we like and the music that we champion is found in the margins. It's not necessarily found in the places that you would expect it to. And we like the idea that there's something utopian about the idea that any form of music reproduced somewhere, as long as it connects people, is music worth championing. So yeah, I guess I would say the kind of venues that I really like have to thank are like car parks, like Tesco, Sainsbury's car parks. If you're not from the UK, those are kind of like the standard like supermarkets, and places like skate parks, you know, places where it's a little bit freer than the constraints of a typical venue setup.
I'm sure we'll get into this a little bit when we talk about some of the different music scenes across Asia, but you know, from researching ahead of this interview and kind of reading about some of these scenes, you know, it seems that they do exist in the margins, whether it be karaoke bars or, you know, tuk-tuk drivers or, you know, different places that you wouldn't typically associate with music scenes.
Yeah, like transport is such a influential and critical environment for a lot of the music that we as Eastern Margins promotes. Be that Bedot's music in the Philippines, which is typically heard in jeepneys, a form of like jeep converted into bus, used as public transport, or as you say, like tuk-tuks throughout all of Southeast Asia, but especially like Thailand, and all of the music, Sayor, that kind of incubates in those environments. I think the idea of like transport movement is very, very in sync with the kind of music that we champion.
Super cool. So let's talk a little bit about Eastern Margins. It's been a few years now since you guys set it up. Did it kind of originate around the time of the pandemic? Can you tell us the kind of the story of how it got started?
Just before, it started in a rundown East London basement that was semi-legal, to say the least. And I remember the first show that we did. We turned up and we had one working CDJ and 2 working speakers out of a possible 4. But at the time, we were just like, wow, this is still like better than what we had before. So this is a real upgrade. We kind of started it. I started it with my friend Anthony in 2018 as kind of a response to this feeling and reaction that although we'd both been involved in the music scene throughout the most of the 2010s, we never really felt like the East and Southeast Asian aspect of our identity, our heritage, was really connected in any way with the music and the scene that we were a part of. There was always that disconnect there. I remember when I was in university and I was putting on shows, just like basically like uni club nights. I went a whole year, and at the end of it, I went a whole year without booking or working with any artist that was East or Southeast Asian. And I didn't even realize it at the time, but at the end of the year, I was like, I rarely see people that look like me. I rarely see people that I can speak my own language to in these environments. And Eastern Margins was really conceptualized out of that desire to bring those 2 aspects of what we're proud about, electronic and rave music, and our own East and Southeast Asian heritage and upbringing. Bringing those 2 things together, connecting those dots.
So did you start initially as kind of a series of events, parties, kind of a loose collective, and then that sort of crystallized into kind of creating a record label? Or how did you kind of go through that journey, and what was the thinking that kind of led you to it?
Pretty much precisely that. That's a really, really great way to articulate it, actually. It started off as a very, very loose creative project. It was literally just one party after another. The momentum of like naivety, you know, to think like the next thing along, why not? So to do that, and then the pandemic actually, COVID was actually super, super, super instrumental to shaping what Eastern Margins is today. Because actually during COVID, when we couldn't do events, that really, really refocused our attentions and really, really made us reevaluate what are the other ways we can kind of champion this culture and platform it. And that's when we started doing things like we started the record label. we also started doing a lot more live streaming, some of which happened on Mixcloud actually back in the day. And that time was actually for us, in some ways, like I would call it like a really interesting window of creativity. Because I think during the pandemic, what happened was like geography was reduced to a line. There was no difference from calling someone in London that was in South London or calling someone that was in South Jakarta. You did it through the medium of the internet, you did it through the call, because like geography had effectively like collapsed to a line. So during that time, the pandemic is actually where we made a lot of the super, super important connections with people in East and Southeast Asia that became the bedrock of what Eastern Margins is today as a label, event series, and everything else.
That's fascinating. Just how, yeah, we were all sort of stuck at home, and so it didn't really matter if you were next door or 2,000 miles away. It was kind of.
And I always think, that necessity creates innovation. When you don't have options or when you don't have resources available to you, you get creative and you get innovative. And that's reflected in the way Eastern Margins creative practice runs. And it's reflected in the way of a lot of the type of music that we champion, which is fundamentally DIY, quite raw, but incredibly innovative.
So you had these kind of formative experiences in the pandemic, and then you decided kind of to create the record label. Can you tell us a little bit about what is the actual process behind creating a record label? Because, there might be somebody listening to this who has a similar experience to you, is kind of has a loose-knit collective of people kind of throwing events and having fun time, and they want to kind of formalize it and create a record label. So what does that actually mean in practice?
I mean, we're definitely still learning, and we made a lot of mistakes. Well, I wouldn't call them mistakes, but we would have done things differently if we knew then what we know now. But I think the real genesis of the label, and I think something critical that every label should have, is a mission and a purpose. I think in 2025 and in the future, with how easy it is to distribute music and to access music across social media and streaming platforms, like the traditional role of a label in getting music to people has transformed a lot, because artists themselves can self-distribute and can get their music to their fans in very, very efficient ways. I think the purpose of a record label 2025, when we started the label in 2020, now is to serve as basically almost a flag for it to represent something, for it to have a set of aesthetic or sonic values or cultural values that the artists on the roster and the music that is put out all kind of get behind and can all champion. So that was one of the first things that we wanted to do at the genesis of the Eastern Margins label, is we wanted to champion something. And what we wanted to champion was basically underground and alternative electronic music from East and Southeast Asia. And that was why we got started. I think over the time, we learned a load of things. We learned the boring things about, like deal terms of like license agreements. We learn how to do like reporting. We learn how to do like metadata for distribution. And we learn a lot of very exciting things on the creative side of, what does it mean to like market a record in 2025 or 2024, 2023 for that matter. But we definitely kind of built the plane as we were flying it. And we definitely had like perilous like crashes along the way, I think.
I'd love to kind of dig into that in terms of kind of, you talked a little bit about working with different artists across East Asia and Southeast Asia in terms of kind of bringing them onto the record label. I know you've done various compilations like the Red Line one, and I think just today or recently you released Now That's What I Call Boodots. Is that the title?
Yeah, exactly.
Yeah. Featuring, I think, is it DJ Love?
DJ Love. It's a collection of remixes by Filipino dots icon DJ Love.
Yeah. So I'd love to kind of dig into that, because obviously you guys, I think most of the team is based in the UK, but has a kind of heritage and kind of background from different parts of Asia. But I think I would love to dig into like how you guys in the UK are working with these artists, halfway across the world, and how you actually, the very practical nature of like, do you sign them for a release? Do you sign them from an album? How does it work when it starts to get to the streaming rights and collecting revenues and paying out those royalties? I'd love to kind of really dig into those details.
Yeah, definitely. I think zooming out from just the record label side of it, one thing that's worth mentioning is the way that Eastern Margins is set up. It's quite modular. So on top of being a record label, we also do artist management. We also book an agency, and we also, just arrange one-off shows for our artists and promote our own events. And the way we work with artists is effectively identifying what the thing is they need and working with them only for that specific thing. So if someone already has a very, very good grasp of what they're doing on the recorded music side, we'll leave them to it. Like, they're killing it. They don't need us, but we might be able to elevate what they're doing on like the show side, on the booking side. We might be able to amplify that. So the way we work is quite broad and quite diversified. And I think it's something that's actually been really made possible in like the last 5, 6, 7 years with the way that like technology and the way that information has become easier to kind of handle. 20 years ago, a record label couldn't be a booking agency because a record label would have to have a really, really good sense of like physical manufacturing, retail channels, how to get music in the physical hands of like journalists and like radio pluggers. Maybe not 20 years ago, maybe like 30 or 40 years ago is more appropriate. But realistically now, like everything is just an email or a website, whether you're booking shows, whether you're putting out releases, it's the same kind of platforms that are relevant. You're going to be using your social media platforms. You're going to be using your productivity suites. You're going to be using kind of the same set of tools. So for us, the important thing is actually identifying the artist and the culture that we want to work with, and then figuring out where we fit in that picture, rather than the other way around of being, we are record label or we are booking agency. We are looking for people who want these things. We look to the culture first. We look to the music first, because that is ultimately the most important thing for all of it.
So if we were to take like the recent example with this DJ Love, that's what I call Budot. Did you guys approach him and did you kind of talk to him about this project that you had the idea for, or was it the other way around where he kind of wanted to work with you guys on certain aspects of things?
It was actually a lot more organic than that. DJ Love is a great example of the way we tend to like working. So DJ Love's manager is a absolute legend of the Filipino underground electronic music scene called Jorge. Also artist alias Similar Objects and the Beast Dogma 777. And we first got in touch with Jorge back in, I think, 2019, just before the pandemic, but really that relationship blossomed over the pandemic, where he had released a record exploring Budots, which is this like Filipino electronic music genre that kind of sounds like if your car speaker had been like hijacked by like 12-year-old kids. And it's incredibly shrill and it's incredibly addictive and it's incredibly like authentic and local to the Philippines. And Jorge, back then under his alias Similar Objects, had put out a release kind of exploring what Budots could be in a more experimental context. So we linked up with Jorge. He ended up putting out a single on our first compilation, Redline Impact, in 2024. Jorge started managing DJ Love, who is the originator of kind of Budots. DJ Love had this massive boiler room moment in 2023, which really started to put Budots on like the global landscape. And just had a very natural conversation with Jorge where it was like, look, there's a lot actually of like international tension around Budots and around DJ Love. How could we crystallize this? Like, how could we make this a bigger thing? How could we amplify it and elevate something that is already amazing? So that's how we got started talking around the record label side. and also around the booking side. So right now we work with DJ Love to release his music, but we also represent him for bookings in a number of territories.
Awesome. And I noticed you guys is Bandcamp kind of the primary platform that you put releases out on, or do you use other ones as well?
We're pretty platform agnostic. We are on all streaming platforms. I think, for us, there's a lot of criticism around, let's say, certain streaming platforms, certain DSPs out there. But I think for us, with the type of music that we're working with, the goal is to get it as wide as possible and to have as many people to kind of recognize it and to hear it. So we're pretty platform agnostic around like where our music is listened to or where it's even consumed. I'm still of like the opinion that if you want to pirate our music and download it for free, like go for it. I'm still waiting for the days like where I can go on like a Chinese or Russian file sharing website and there's a whole dedicated thread to Eastern Margins. That's like, for me, that's like the critical mass point.
That's when you've reached success. You've kind of made it. You're like,
exactly,
yes,
exactly.
And are some of the kind of platforms and services, there's a whole variety of them across East Asia and Southeast Asia, right? Like I know NetEase Music being a fairly large one in China, but then are there kind of different ones across the region?
Definitely. This is something that perhaps people outside the region don't appreciate all the nuances of. But across East and Southeast Asia, the DSP and streaming platform, and even just like the music consumption platforms are very, very different from the rest of the world. The chief example is China. I'm sure a lot of people on this podcast listening know that China has its basically completely own internet ecosystem. So the big DSPs within China are NetEase, or in Chinese it's called Wang Yi, and QQ Music. But there's also a whole different set of social media platforms. So there's an equivalent of TikTok called Douyin. There's an analog to Twitter called Weibo. And there's also things like Xiaohongshu, which have become popular recently due to the situation around TikTok. So China has its own analog. And one other thing, maybe we can get into this more later, is like the way that the rights landscape is set up in China is incredibly different from the rest of the world. Within China, the DSPs are rights holders. So the likes of Tencent, which owns certain DSPs, and the likes of NetEase, which own Wang Yi, they will actually acquire the copyrights to music. So this is as if though Spotify were acquiring IP to music on its platform. So in a lot of ways, like the DSP landscape in mainland China is a lot more vertically concentrated and condensed compared to the rest of the world. And that brings about with it quite unique dynamics. What happens in like a recorded music market where the source of consumption is also a rights holder? How does a major label exist in that context? How does an independent label exist in that context? What does it mean for publishing? All of those questions are like super, super complex. And I don't confess to like fully understand them myself, but that's just one market. That's just China. Then you have whole other dynamics across the region where, for example, like in Japan, obviously you have the massive physical market. But what people might not realize as well is in Japan, Apple Music is way bigger than Spotify. Apple Music has probably like 2 or 3 times the amount of MAU as Spotify. Or if you hop to another region, like you hop to like Philippines, the major DSPs like YouTube Music, and the free tier and the pay tier in YouTube in the Philippines is very, very different from where it is in the rest of the world, because it's about like access, and people can't access at necessarily the price ranges that some people in Europe or North America might be able to access. And I think basically that was really, really zoomed in, but to zoom out, big like macro picture, what this means on a cultural level is that there's a lot of amazing music and a lot of amazing culture that is very, very local to East and Southeast Asia that is quite difficult for people outside of the region to access or to understand. Leaving aside the linguistic barriers, there are also platform and technology barriers across these different kind of buckets. And that's kind of one of our goals with Eastern Margins, is to take the really exciting stuff that is kind of behind these barriers and to recontextualize it so that people in New Jersey or Birmingham or like Cologne might be able to understand it.
Do you also think about it in terms of between the different countries in the region? Like, for example, DJ Love from the Philippines, if you wanted to bring his music to China, would you have to choose one of those streaming services in order to they effectively acquire the rights to it? Do you have to choose NetEase or one of the other ones?
It depends on what you want to do. There are options. So there are ways to basically have your music available on all Chinese streaming platforms. Say if you're DJ Love and you want to release your next EP, but if you want perhaps to do a deal with NetEase to basically sell like your IP, your copyrights over to them, they might insist on exclusivity. So there's definitely a lot of dynamics in play within the region. And what's actually quite interesting to see is the inter-region dynamics often map onto broader geopolitical trends. So there are actually quite a lot of established Chinese record labels and Chinese, let's call them rights companies, who are very active now in Southeast Asia, acquiring copyright and acquiring IP. So there are analogies to the likes of like Hypnosis that operate within East and Southeast Asia, and they tend to be from East Asian countries, China, Japan especially, and they operate in Southeast Asia to acquire IP. This kind of stuff is pretty much like very rarely reported in like English language press, how it's like rarely reported in like Chinese or like Japanese language press. But there's an interesting dynamic there about how geopolitical power dynamics and how like economic disparity also maps onto like a cultural level.
Yeah, just quick reference for anybody listening who's not familiar with Hypnosis. It's a music publishing company out of the UK that acquired a lot of publishing rights and built up a very large catalog. I think set up by maybe it was Nile Rodgers' former manager, something like that.
Yeah.
But so essentially what you're seeing is kind of a sort of acquisition of rights and intellectual property of these artists and songwriters flowing from some of the Southeast Asian countries to some of the North ones, or is that being too generalistic?
Yeah, I think it's probably too much of a stretch to say that's like a massive trend, but it's more something to highlight as happening in the region. I think what you said though, the question there actually contains quite a interesting dynamic where in a lot of European and North American markets, most IP, when it comes to record label and publishing, or not most, but a significant portion of it is done on license terms. So artists and original rights holders will license their IP, be that on the master side or on the publishing side, to a record label or to a publisher. Within East and Southeast Asia, it is much, much more paradigmatic to have outright acquisition of IP. So it is much, much more common for record labels or, tech platforms in China to just outright acquire IP. So to completely buy the rights to it so that the artists not only no longer receive any royalties, but no longer have any control over what happens with that IP. It's a straight sell. It's no longer a license. That kind of structure is way more common and way more prevalent in East and Southeast Asia than it is in UK, Europe, North America, and arguably probably like South America as well.
So is that something that when you're working with some of the artists across the region that they kind of are surprised by when they work with you and kind of, actually, I'm assuming that you do it as a kind of licensed kind of model, but
definitely it's actually like something that sets us apart in a lot of ways, that we're able to speak to artists and be like, look, we're not going to own your masters. Like, we don't work like that. We work in partnership with you. We're going to work together to promote, amplify, elevate the music, and we both benefit from it. And that can often be one of the only offers that they have that's on like licensed terms compared to some of the more other offers which are outright acquisitions. But I would say as well, there are a lot of other companies who also still adopt like licensing business model within the region as well. I think the likes of like 1RPM have been very, very aggressive in the region. Believe as well are very, very well established in the region, and they typically worked to license terms. So it's starting to change the dynamics, but the old school traditional kind of established players, as a very broad generalization, will lean more towards outright acquisition.
So how do you guys at Eastern Margins think about the economics of running the record label side of things, in addition to artist management, booking agency? Can you give us a little bit of an insight into like what's the split of revenue that comes in from each?
Yeah, so for us, it's a pretty even split across the board, actually. And that allows us to be quite diversified in terms of projects that we're working and when they're kind of like fallow periods that are like natural through the year. So it's a pretty even split across like the record label, across management, and also across like bookings. That's leaving aside like the event side of Eastern Margins, which is it's completely kind of its own thing. And that is actually quite big, probably bigger combined than some of those other things that we mentioned. I think it's a lot of what we decide is decided on both a cultural and business lens. So we're a small company in the grand scheme of things. We only have 2 people who work full time, and then a bunch of very talented freelancers that we work with projects. Realistically, like we're never going to be able to compete on scale. Like we're never going to be able to even compete on like pace. Bigger distributors are always going to be able to interpret data quicker than us. They have more tools, they have more analytics, they have more people looking at it. And the bigger players are able to lay more bets in terms of how much capital they have, how much like resources they have to work concurrent campaigns. But, and this is actually, I guess, like quite traditional in a lot of ways, like where we as Eastern Margins do think we can win is on the cultural level. We think there are certain projects, certain artists, certain records out there where not only can we tell those stories better than anyone else because we have the nuance, but the artist also wants us to tell those stories in a certain way. And that is kind of like the perfect kind of like case where like both the business and the cultural angle kind of like marry up neatly. And those are the kind of projects that we work hard to try and identify. And those are the projects that we focus on effectively.
In the episode before this one, I interviewed a guy named Yancey Strickler who started Kickstarter and then is now working on a new project called Meta Label. And we had a very interesting conversation about his new project Meta Label, which is around this idea of a small group of people, you know, half a dozen to a dozen or so, coming together and what they can creatively put together and release out into the world, and how powerful a small group of people can be. And so we talked a little bit about Odd Future, Tyler the Creator's Collective in the States, a few other collectives like that, where, you know, it doesn't take a huge number of people. And in fact, there's a lot of benefits to being a small team, being a tight-knit group of people who probably do have a more nuanced understanding of a certain cultural space, a music scene, scenes, an art space, or whatever it may be. So I think this idea that everyone should try and scale and be teams of hundreds or thousands, I think it's a very kind of like Silicon Valley-esque Western sort of like industrialist, like bigger is always better. And I don't think that's necessarily true.
It's like the startupification of like creativity, basically, where everything becomes a P&L line, everything becomes, you know, like a risk reward kind of thing, which like, look, let's be real, like partly it is, but I think it's really interesting what the advent of like short form video and especially like platforms like TikTok and then things like IG Reels and YouTube Shorts has meant in that respect. I think it's swung a lot of the industry quite hard in a direction where people think that data and analytics can be a very accurate predictor of performance, let's call it. Not performance, but performance is too euphemistic to put it. Data and analytics becomes a very, very accurate predictor of where culture is going. And I think it's definitely true to some respect, but I think in a big, complex world with so many people involved, data and analytics can sometimes miss certain little things in pockets in the margins. So that's where we think we can win, basically. And that's where we think we can find artists that want to win with us in that respect.
Yeah, I mean, I definitely think that data and analytics is super powerful when you're looking backwards, when you're looking historically. I'm less convinced about the idea that it's good at figuring out the future. What sounds are going to be exciting, what scenes are going to grow and rise. Like, you know, this is perhaps a kind of philosophical stance, but I think at Mixcloud, you know, we are very invested in the idea of humans and people curating music and the power of people to do that, who might find those things on the margins. They might dig to the back of the physical or digital record bin and find that weird Turkish funk album and, you know, put that on because they're interested in the weirdness of it.
It's also kind of like, you know, the big thing on the horizon with the advent of like AI and how fast that's moving. I think it's a fool's game to think something like data analysis won't be able to be done more efficiently by AI, like very, very quickly. But at what point is AI going to be able to predict cultural direction and human taste? That I do think is a long way off. I'm not saying we'll never get there with like AGI, but that's something where I think we're pretty far a long way off. And I think that's why we as Eastern Margins and I myself, like what I believe in, like to kind of like operate. To give you like an example, right? Like with everything that's going on TikTok, and like for full transparency, like I worked at TikTok for 3.5 years, from like 2020 to 2023. So got to see a lot of like the internal mechanisms of it. But you know, like people, especially major labels, big distributors, using TikTok to see what is the trending sound, what is the thing that is going to pop off, like what can we pour fire on? Like they can't predict that like shoegaze from the 90s is all of a sudden going to like completely take over the For You pages of kids from like Oklahoma to like Manchester to like Jakarta. But if you are part of the cult, if you're looking at it from a cultural lens, you can actually see that like what shoegaze represents, that connection to kind of like suburban ennui, maybe does actually map quite closely onto like a post-pandemic world where people are feeling like quite isolated, where people are feeling like emotionally distant from each other. And I think something like shoegaze having that massive moment is completely like a cultural thing. It's not a numbers thing. It's not something that they could have predicted, even like looking at just the numbers of what was becoming interesting. Obviously, you can see when it starts trending and be like, okay, now it's trending, now it's picking up. But ultimately, where creativity goes is a human endeavor. And I think the examples that you cited around kind of like Odd Future, and I would cite like a Korean group like Balm and Tiger, they're great examples of when small groups of humans get together and they hone in on a cultural or creative proposition that they think will resonate and does resonate. And I think, yeah, small groups of people can actually do that better than mega companies, and can definitely right now do that better than AI.
I'd love to talk a little bit about, you know, when you started the label or music company, some of the ideas that you had going into it, and then maybe fast forward now kind of 4 or 5 years later, things that you've learned along the way, whether they're, you know, mistakes or lessons that you can share with us that somebody else might be able to learn from and appreciate?
Yeah. I think the first mistake and a big thing that I've learned with operating a record label is actually learning to let go a little bit. I think, you know, as a fan of music and in certain aspects of the music industry, it's actually, you're super passionate about something, right? Like that's the whole magic of music. You become passionate about a project, about a scene, about an artist, and you really, really, really want to like work with them. But actually, like in a record label, in a lot of ways, like you are not the captain of your own ship as much as you think you are. Like sometimes you let like the tides of culture take you where things need to go. And being comfortable with that and realizing like you're not actually going to be able to release like that record that you absolutely want to work with that artist actually opens more doors to some other stuff that you couldn't have predicted. But turns out you were really, 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 really good fit for each other. And I think in the early days of the label, we were very, very kind of, wedded to kind of like releasing records a certain way and doing things with certain artists. And that slowed us down in a lot of ways and actually blinded us to some cooler stuff that was like happening in our community and in our scenes, because we were too hemmed in by basically being like, right, we got to do it like this way. So yeah, letting go, I think, is actually quite a like useful rubric that we kind of like have learned across the years of operating a record label.
Sort of like you have to be open to different types of creative partnerships.
Yeah,
and less
exactly.
sort of fixated on one particular path or type of partnership and kind of just being more open to it is what you're saying.
Yeah, and I guess there's a level of like humbleness or like ego death that comes with that, to be kind of like, actually like what you think might be cool or might be interesting might just be a complete miss, or the way that you want to work a release or with an artist is like completely not how they want to work it or how it needs to be worked. And actually letting go, being open to other kind of creative opportunities that come along can open more doors than the ones that get closed.
Do you guys A&R things kind of collectively, like within your team? Do you kind of listen to stuff and think about like what could be potential partnerships? Or is it kind of each person brings something to the table and they're like, this is a partnership that I'd really like to work on?
It's a mix of both. I think it depends on like the size and the scale of the project. If it's a big project that requires a lot of resource and budget, we're all going to need to get behind it. And there's a level of like consensus that needs to be reached. But at the same time, we love like the organized chaos of like people working on their own projects that they're really, really passionate about, because that's when people become like more than the sum of their parts, is when people kind of click into something that they're super, super engaged in. So it's actually like one of the things like I've been working on quite recently, which is to like empower not only the team at Eastern Margins, but actually some of the artists on our label to be like, look, what do you think like should be released and how do we kind of work on releasing that? So yeah, decentralizing what we do in some ways.
That's awesome.
Yeah.
I'd love to kind of maybe shift gears a little bit and talk about some of the music scenes that you guys kind of support and champion in East Asia and Southeast Asia. So we've kind of touched on a few of them a little bit. So Budot's from the Philippines, but I'm sure that there's others, and would love to just hear from you, which are the ones that you've found exciting and that you're kind of team champion and support.
Yeah, I think with Eastern Margins and label, we have a philosophy or a concept called redline. It's built from the idea of like redlining on like a mixer or like over compressing. Like when you redline something, you create distortion, and in those distortion becomes new artifacts, new mutations that didn't exist before. And in a lot of ways, we apply that technical concept to culture. Well, we're interested in exploring are sounds that are pushed to their limits and then create like new mutations and new hybrids, new distortions. So this concept of like red line manifests itself in a lot of different types of music that we champion, really interested in. But on kind of base kind of case is all of these, especially through Southeast Asia, a lot of these electronic subgenres that are all characterized by being very like high energy, very DIY, and very raw and volatile in a lot of ways. And it sounds like Budot from the Philippines, Funkot, Dundert, Bass Baton, and jedug jedug from Indonesia. Indonesia probably has like one of the richest tapestries of all of these like electronic subgenres out of anywhere in Southeast Asia. Wiener House in Vietnam, Manyao in Malaysia, within China, a lot of the stuff that happens in like Dombey in the northeast, like it's very like influenced by like hard bass and like donk from like Russia. A lot of these genres form the basis of the projects that we love and we want to champion. Because for us, those genres represent that like red line philosophy, that red line energy. Because these are genres like stitched together from like the influences of like Westerners and red light districts of all of these cities, mashed with traditional folk instrumentation and traditional kind of like local culture. And those mutations and those hybrids are like what we find super, super exciting. And those are the scenes that we try and champion with Eastern Margins.
That's awesome. I was reading the Crack magazine piece about you guys earlier, and I think you used the term maximalist in that to kind of describe this type of music, and I think that's such a perfect term for describing how it sort of fills the sonic space in a lot of ways. And I'm curious if you feel as though there's something about the day-to-day life or existence in the places where these music scenes come from that have given rise to this sort of maximalist, joyous, kind of somewhat chaotic kind of sound. What is it about these places and the kind of the urban geography, or maybe it's not even urban, the geography of these places?
I think it's, as a sound to thrive in those environments, you got to stand out. You got to cut through. If you are in a traffic jam in Jakarta, the cacophony of noises that are going on, music's got to be able to cut through to make an impact, you know? And that influences the way that music is composed, and it influences even kind of like the mixing frequencies of music created in the region. And also very important is like, how is most music like reproduced? I think a lot of this music, there's like a level of like snobbery from what I would call like the global dance music hegemony about these music, because it doesn't subscribe to like traditional notions of what is dance music. A lot of this music has no sub, like it's very, very, very like thin on the low end. And it's because like, if your music's going to be produced by like 10-year-old Bluetooth speakers on the back of a tuk-tuk, they're not going to be able to reproduce sub. So why would you fill your like mixing frequencies with loads of sub? You're gonna absolutely ram it with loads of treble because you want it to cut across. And that music is perfect for its environment. And that means for us, it's like super, 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 super authentic like expression. And I think it's a shame, and it's something we're trying to like actively like resist. I think it's a shame that people outside of the region don't recognize that as innovation, rather they recognize it as almost like backwardness or not quite like refined enough. And actually, I would say it's even more refined because it's much, much more precise about like the environment that it's currently reproduced in. So yeah, like environment is a huge factor shaping how these music genres sound.
So if somebody listening wanted to kind of like discover a little bit more about these, obviously you guys have put out the Redline Impact compilation. Yeah. What are other places and ways that they can kind of listen to more of what Eastern Margins is doing and perhaps kind of peers, you know, in other places around the world?
I would say the number one thing, like beyond listening to our records, is like go to those places and just like put your phone on airplane mode and just like let the cities, let the noises like guide you. Because we're also like very, very like cognizant of the fact that like a lot of us are based in the UK. We obviously spend a lot of time in East and Southeast Asia. We do a lot of shows there, but we're still outsiders in a lot of ways. Like we will never understand these genres as well as someone like based on the ground. And we also don't think there's any like substitute for just going and kind of like experiencing it. I always have such a joy when we like bring some of like diasporic artists to kind of like the region, and I don't tell them about certain things like, like the Vienna House, like cabs that will take you from the airport, from like the Saigon airport into central Saigon, and what that experience is like. And like hearing, like, we get the sense of joy from just like hearing like their surprise at it and what it sounds like, because there's no replacement for like experiencing it locally, like there in person. What we ultimately try and do is try and reproduce even a little bit of that magic, either through recording music or through bringing artists elsewhere or doing like shows.
It reminds me of I haven't ever been to Vietnam, but I was once in South Africa and just, refilling gas at a gas station with a rental car, and they're playing house music there. And I'm on piano music in like the gas station where, traditionally in the UK, US, or lots of places, it would be kind of mainstream top 40 pop music or something like that. And just that sense of like, oh, wow, this is completely different musical context where this is kind of like just the regular mainstream normal music that you listen to at a gas station. That was amazing. And I was curious, like, okay, if I know it's hard to pick favorites or top 3 or something, but like if somebody's listening to this and they were thinking about, next year I want to go to East Asia or Southeast Asia, what are like 3 experiences that you would say are just kind of incredibly unique and that you would recommend to somebody listening?
I would say go to Saigon. Saigon has got to be one of the most exciting electronic music scenes, I think, for me, like in the world. Like the unique dynamic of kind of like the population structure. Some like mad statistic, like 75% of Vietnam is under the age of 35. Like that dynamic, that's actually largely, unfortunately, because of the tragedies of the Vietnam War and how closely it's been. But that dynamic means like that is an incredible incubator for youth culture when you just have so much population that is like young, single, kind of looking for places to commute. And I think Saigon is such a hotbed of innovation and creativity. There are crews there, Bun Lun, Gai Nei, that are really, really pushing the envelope of both combining sounds that are very, very local with like global electronic scenes. There's an incredible Boiler Room that's just been published. That was a collaboration between Gai Nei and Bun Lun that showcases a lot of those sounds. I think that's like a great starting point. It's kind of a map of a lot of sounds for people to check out. I think Saigon for sure. I think one scene that I'm personally a bit closer to, because my background is Chinese, is there's definitely a new generation. We call it like New China, where it's a lot of kids, and this is quite a decentralized scene. It's really interesting. A lot of kids who might live in, but don't really, really have strong ties to like tier 1 cities, but have very, very strong ties to tier 2, tier 3, smaller cities in China, provincial cities that a lot of like people in Asia might not have even heard of, let alone people in like Europe or like North America. Talking about places like Shenyang, Jilin in the north, like Guizhou in like the southwest, or like a lot of provincial cities in like Guangdong. A lot of artists in these cities are taking the sounds that are like, in Chinese we call it like tu hai, which is it's a pejorative term that means low quality electronic music. It's taking a lot of those influences of like tu hai and like creating their own new version of it that like mixes it with like bleeding edge, like EDM sleaze America, like post drain gang sounds, and their own like local, very, very kind of like crude music forms. That scene is super exciting. That's a scene we're working on loads with Eastern Margins at the moment. And I guess that scene is a very, in a lot of ways, like Chinese scene.
And that one, I guess, where would you say, like if you had to choose one of those tier 2 kind of cities to go and visit, where would you say you might be able to experience that?
I would say go to Xiaohongshu, like the app, like Red, which has become very popular with like everything going on TikTok. That is, you see the aesthetics, you see the sounds of it on the app. That scene is in a way a lot more decentralized than perhaps like what I mentioned around Saigon. And that's what actually makes it quite exciting. Like no one city owns it. no one artist really owns it. It feels very diffuse. And because of that, it feels quite like volatile. Like it could disappear or it could go in a completely unexpected direction. And I think that's super, super exciting.
That's awesome. I remember about now like 10 or 11 years ago, Vina House on Mixcloud just sort of blew up. I think you were working with us at the time, and I think that that is a great example of how I think for whatever reason Mixcloud became adopted by a lot of the DJs and people producing the music there, and it sort of developed this community of people who were all mixing Vina House music. And it's just so interesting that you have these kind of scenes and platforms and places where these sounds kind of pop up and grow. And I guess, in some ways they can kind of mutate and evolve, and be super interesting to see kind of in the work that you guys do, how you can help that mutation and evolution and see, where these sounds go in the next 2, 3, 5 years.
Yeah. And like Vietnam and the scenes there, like, oh my God, like it moves so quickly. Like we pretty much like tour in Asia every year at this point. And Vietnam is like the one place that every time I go, I'm just like, I literally like do not like know any of this music from even like the last like time I was here, even like the artists and everything. And it's so innovative, and it's so exciting and really like flourishing on its own terms.
Moving very quickly. This is making me want to book a trip back to somewhere in East Asia or Southeast Asia. It's been too long. Sweet, man. Well, I think we've covered quite a lot of ground. Is there any other kind of topics or things that you think would be kind of useful to share or kind of interesting to cover?
Yeah, I think one thing we kind of touched on briefly, we perhaps didn't get into as much detail, is we were talking earlier about how like the environment impacts a lot of the ways that this music is made and what it prioritizes. I think one thing that we've seen a lot of at Eastern Margins is actually how it's starting to coincide with how culture and music is consumed globally. And I think on this, one of the key main changes is like people listening to music on their phone speakers. Like that dynamic is something I don't think can be overstated in terms of how important it is. Like from 20 years ago, going from listening to music mostly on headphones or listening like on hi-fi speakers. A lot of people first discover music now like on their TikTok For You page, on their Douyin For You page, playing out of phone speakers. And that I think has a huge feedback loop with the types of music that become popular, that become prevalent. A sub-bass heavy type of music, like let's say reggae or dub or dubstep, is very like hard to reproduce on phone speakers. But something like funk art from Indonesia or like Vina House from Vietnam that was always designed to be played on shitty speakers is going to cut right across all of it. And it's going to pop out at you on your phone speakers, on your For You page. And I think it's led to some like really interesting opportunities for like music from the region to reach a global audience. There have been a lot of like Vina House tracks that have become like globally trending hits. There was that one called Spirit Bomb. There was that one by Kai's, that was a Vina House remix. Budots has had such a global recognition now, to the point that it's been adopted by everyone from like Olivia Rodrigo to like Kamala Harris in her like last campaign. And it's because like the power of that music when reproduced on phone speakers is a couple of levels above like some other subgenres. Sounds louder and it sounds punchier on phones than perhaps other forms of dance music. And it's proven to actually be a massive advantage, I would say, for a lot of the music that we work with and champion from the region, because we're able to sound louder to a kid on their For You page. And ultimately, loudness, for better or for worse, is one of like the most like accurate kind of representatives of like connection and of like catchiness. So yeah, I think that's something that perhaps like we're still trying to uncover the exact consequences of it, but perhaps hasn't been appreciated more broadly is the impact of how people are consuming music on their phones is favoring certain genres more than others.
That's super interesting, because I've thought about that often in terms of more the visual side of things, in terms of the way, you know, we film things vertically now for camera phones and, you know, TikToks and Instagrams and YouTubes, shorts and things like that. But I think you're absolutely right that in terms of the sonic side of things, the music that works best will be that kind of leverages the equipment that people are using, which is, you're right, it's portable phones, right? And so most phones don't have a built-in subwoofer, so, you know.
We've actually, like, on the record label side, maybe this is a bit of like the secret sauce, but yeah, like we started doing like separate masters for like DSPs versus like Bandcamp. So we'll submit a master that has way more mid-range frequency for like streaming platforms like Spotify and TikTok than we will for Bandcamp, because a lot of people on Bandcamp will download it for like club use. And there, you know, like on a system, you do need those bass frequencies, you need those subs. So for like, yeah, certain records, like we'll do 2 different masters. And I think, I mean, maybe I'm overstating that. I think a lot of people have like done that already for a long time, but we make it quite like a conscious decision now for like a lot of our releases.
Yeah, I think that's super smart. So if somebody wanted to kind of learn more about kind of what you guys are doing and what you're putting out there, where should they go? Like Eastern Margin Bandcamp? What are the websites, social media handles, things like that?
We're on all the socials. We're on all the platforms. Eastern Margins is the name, best way to find us. I would say for anyone who's not familiar with what we do, probably the artist I recommend them to check out is one, DJ Love, pioneer of Budots and such an important core creative visionary in terms of what we do. Second, I would say is Mina no Komochi. They're like a crazy experimental, like trance cult is the best way to describe themselves, from Tokyo. And they're kind of like a roving duo that kind of pushing their own take on like trance and techno maxed out to their limits. Those 2. And then I think the third one is Toji from Japan. Again, like visionary of combining rap music with rave music and melding that in kind of a very, very like East Asian context, bringing influences like para dancing from the 90s, and also like really, really pioneer in terms of working within the region, working with like a lot of like Vietnamese directors, working with a lot of like Chinese artists. So DJ Love, Mina no Komochi, Toji, those would be my like entry points before you get
starting off points.
Weird, yeah, exactly.
And I know, like we mentioned earlier, you guys have just released that. Now that's what I call Budots just today. So very, very, very timely. Any other projects coming through in the pipeline in 2025 that you can maybe hint at or give us a heads up on?
Something I alluded to a bit earlier, but this new China scene, we have a lot of records out from artists from that world. And I'm really, really excited to kind of showcase that diffuse entropy of that kind of scene. And I think it's going to take a lot of people by surprise, actually, in terms of what the artists are telling and what stories they're telling. So I'm super excited to unroll that. I guess the other thing that we're doing, which is a biggie, is on the event side, which is a huge part of what we do. We have our festival in London this year. So that will take place in September, and it's called Margins United. And can't reveal all the details, but I can reveal that it's going to be pretty large in terms of scale, and it's probably going to be like the biggest physical nexus of all of these different cultures that we've just discussed in like one place.
Awesome. And you guys, was last year the inaugural year for the festival?
Last year was the inaugural year. So this year is going to be the challenging second album, and we're going to fuck it up, basically.
No, I heard really good things about it. I know a few people who went. Yeah, check that out if you can make it in London in September. Sweet, man. Well, David, I think it's been amazing talking to you, getting some insights from you, and I've got a lot of listening to do and hearing some of these new sounds on my phone. So yeah, thank you again for joining us on the podcast. It's been a pleasure. Hope to have you back someday.
Thank you so much for having me on the Inside Track. It's a pleasure.
Good stuff. All right, take care.